Imagine waking up and realizing you've been isekai'd into a novel you used to read. A world full of gorgeous women. Sounds like a dream, right? Wrong. Because when you see the mirror, you realize you're that third-rate dumbass of a villain. You are a disposable punching bag meant to get his ass kicked and erased like trash before chapter 20. No cheats, no plot armor, just a death sentence. And this is what happened to our protagonist. A majestic castle with towering spires rose among the green hills, its grand silhouette screaming, "Old money and aristocratic drama live here." This was the home of the Campbell family, and within its opulent walls, a young man suddenly bolted upright in bed, his disheveled blonde hair adding to his overall look of, what the hell just happened? His hands clutched the blanket as he blinked blearily, trying to process his situation. He remembered dying, very clearly. The truck, the impact, the moment his soul probably got ejected from his body like a DVD from an outdated player. And yet, here he was, alive and in a freaking castle. He stared at his hands, then at the luxurious Western-style room straight out of a historical drama. Okay, either I'm in a really weird dream or I've been isekai'd. Please, let it be the first one. Stumbling towards a mirror, he took in his reflection. A young man, 17 or 18 at most, with a familiar yet subtly different face. Then it hit him. He was in someone else's body, and not just anyone. Panic set in like an unwanted house guest. He could have been reborn as some chosen hero, or at least a sidekick with potential. But no, fate had a twisted sense of humor. His gaze flickered to a book on the nightstand, the very novel he used to read religiously, The Strongest Heroine in History. And in that novel existed a particular character, a certain useless, pathetic, womanizing idiot who got exiled and forgotten by chapter 20, Moon Campbell. The name alone made him want to punch something hard. "Oh, fantastic," he muttered bitterly. "I got reborn as a third-rate villain whose main achievement in life was making an overpowered heroine's life mildly inconvenient." He grabbed a knife off the ornate dresser and made a small cut on his finger, wincing as sharp, searing pain confirmed his worst fear. Nope, not a dream. Just my new personal hell. Before he could wallow any further in his cosmic misfortune, a knock on the door shattered his spiraling thoughts. "Enter," he said, barely masking his existential crisis. A maid, Anne, stepped inside with the grace of someone who had dealt with rich idiots before. She informed him that his outfit for tomorrow's banquet had arrived. Normally, past Moon would have dismissed her with a lazy wave. Today, however, present Moon was too distracted by his impending doom to bother playing the role of a spoiled noble. "Sure, whatever," he muttered, waving her off. Anne, however, was sharp-eyed. Her gaze flickered to his hand where a thin line of red still glistened. "My lord, you're injured." "Huh? Oh, it's nothing, just a scratch." "I can take care of it," she said, stepping closer. For a brief, blissful second, he assumed she meant bringing a bandage. Logical. Sensible. What actually happened was something straight out of an awkward anime scene. Before he could react, Anne took his hand, brought it to her lips, and licked the wound. His brain completely blue-screened, his entire body locked up as he stared at her, horrified. Was all he managed. She released his hand with a satisfied smile. "There, not a drop of your precious blood wasted." Did she just call his blood precious? What was he, a rare steak? His mouth opened and closed as he struggled to process what had just happened. Anne, meanwhile, was completely unfazed. She touched her lips teasingly and said, "Take care of yourself, my lord." Then, like licking your employer's wound was the most normal thing in the world, she turned and left. When the door closed behind her, he exhaled heavily, his heart racing. Then, like a delayed slap to the face, realization struck. His face turned redder than a scandalous love affair. and he covered it with his hands. "Jesus, how dirty!" he shrieked, writhing on the bed like a fish out of water. Meanwhile, just outside the door, Anne paused. That had been unexpected. The young master had actually thanked her. That was a first, but her moment of reflection was short-lived because inside the room, Moon Campbell was undergoing a full-scale existential crisis. Why the hell had Moon Campbell provoked the protagonist in the first place? He had everything: good looks, money, a mansion, and a disturbingly devoted maid. If you remembered correctly, his eventual exile came after he attempted to drug the third princess at the coming-of-age ceremony. Well, screw that. Now that he knew in advance, he could just not do that. Revolutionary idea, really. Smirking to himself, he resolved to stay rich, keep his head attached to his body, and avoid exile at all costs. But then a thought struck him and his smirk shattered. When was the ceremony again? As his gaze flicked to the outfit Anne had just delivered, realization dawned. His face froze in horror. Tomorrow. There was a moment of absolute silence before the castle walls shook with a single thunderous cry. Shit! Sprawled on his bed, he frantically searched for any clues about his new world. System, grandfather, goddess, some wise old monk, anyone? Nothing. Silence. What the hell, where are my cheats? I had 5 golden tickets in my last life. Does that mean nothing here? Despair settled in. The ceremony was tomorrow. Tomorrow. It was too late to rewrite history. Would apologizing be enough? Probably not. And then a new nightmare took root. What if they forced him to grovel? What if he had to do something humiliating, like lick the protagonist's feet in public? He shuddered, but then resolved. A real man wasn't afraid of a little humiliation. If it came to that, he'd do it with dignity. As long as she was wearing black stockings, his mind steeled, he made his decision. Tomorrow at the ceremony, he would fall to his knees before the heroine at the speed of light and bow 3 times. But before he could fully embrace his tragic fate, something smacked him right in the head. Ow! What the hell? Rubbing his forehead, he scowled at the object that had so rudely assaulted him. At first glance, it looked like a phone. But upon closer inspection, it was something far more mystical. A book radiating magical energy. His face lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. Yes! My cheats, my God hasn't abandoned me after all. Excited, he clutched the book to his chest. Sure, he was still cannon fodder, but now he had a fighting chance. Determined to seize control of his destiny, he flipped it open, ready for whatever power lay within. And then he froze. The pages were blank. Dead silence. A long, painful blink. What? He flipped through every page, hoping for hidden text, an activation phrase, anything. Nothing. Okay, he muttered. Maybe it needs a ritual? It was a Western European setting after all, and what was the most cliché activation method? Blood. Without thinking too long, he ran his finger across his lip, leaving a small scratch. He let a few drops fall onto the pages, watching intently, waiting for the magic to reveal itself. At that moment, the book began to tremble violently, dark energy swirling around him like an ominous storm. His eyes widened in horror. What the actual hell was happening? Blood ran down his arms and a searing pain ripped through his body. He barely had time to comprehend the situation before everything faded to black. When he awoke, he was chained in a dark room, his body aching, covered in bruises and abrasions. His vision blurred, but soon a girl with chilling red eyes emerged from the shadows. She smiled, sweetly, cruelly. "I've been waiting for you to wake up," she whispered. Panic surged through him. He struggled against the chains, but they held firm. He winced as pain shot through his limbs, and she tisked in disapproval. "Pain is necessary," she said, almost lazily. "It teaches you a lesson." His mind reeled. What lesson? What the hell was going on? She sighed as if disappointed. This shouldn't have happened to you. But it's your own fault, your cruelty, your arrogance, your selfishness. It led you here. He clenched his teeth. Excuse me, what? Ignoring him, she continued, her voice carrying an eerie certainty. You were meant to hurt others, to make them despise you, to make them hate you, and then you would belong only to me. A chill ran down his spine. The girl's lips curled into a grim smile. But something changed. No matter. Her red eyes gleamed. I'll fix you. With my love, no matter how long it takes. His breath hitched, his stomach twisted. We can talk about this. We will always be together. Not even death can separate us. And that's when he screamed. Moon jolted awake, gasping for breath. His heart pounded like a war drum. Cold sweat clung to his skin as he clutched the sheets, struggling to convince himself that it had been just a dream. Or was it? His body still ached. His arms still burned where the chains had held him. It felt real. Glancing at his arm, his breath caught. The cut from earlier was still there, the same one he had used to awaken the book. Dread crawled down his spine. If this book was supposed to be a cheat, then why did it feel like it was actively working against him? With shaky hands, he flipped open the book again. And there, staring back at him in ominous lettering, was a warning. Do not try to change your destiny. He muttered the words aloud, feeling the weight of them settle over him. Dark energy seeped from the pages, an unspoken confirmation of his worst fears. So if he tried to change anything, he'd be screwed. But if he did nothing, he'd still be doomed to exile and disgrace. Brilliant. Just brilliant. He looked out the window, scowling. His initial plan to play nice and stay out of trouble had clearly been a joke. The book wasn't giving him a choice. Fine. If he couldn't change his fate, then he would change everyone else's. His character didn't die in the original story. He just vanished. And if disappearing meant he got a fresh start, then that was exactly what he'd do. But first, food. With renewed determination and a gnawing hunger, Moon devoured the finest meal he had ever tasted. Meat so tender it melted in his mouth. Wine that tasted like pure luxury. Maybe being an aristocrat had some perks after all. His moment of indulgence was interrupted by his mother, Duchess Noyce Campbell. She watched him curiously. You look pleased, she noted. His father, Duke Lon Campbell, chuckled as he sipped his wine. Tomorrow's banquet is an important event for him. Moon, swirling his glass, nodded. I'm looking forward to it. More or less. The Duchess beamed. My son is growing up so fast. He'll have all the young ladies swooning. The Duke, however, had other concerns. He already has a fiancée, remember? Princess Celia. If she gets jealous, it could be a problem. Moon blinked. Who? Memories flooded back. Princess Celia, third princess of the Empire, cold, reserved, mysterious. The kind of woman that had countless admirers, but zero interest in any of them. He held back a bitter laugh. Only his parents thought he was perfect. They were good people, too good. And thanks to the impending scandal at the banquet, they would be exiled. But why? The book insisted he couldn't change his own fate, but it never said anything about changing theirs. Everyone assumed his scandal at the banquet was what doomed them. But the truth was different. His father would be accused of treason, a political conspiracy among the nobility. Moon had a plan. It wasn't the best plan, but when your choices were find the real culprit or get exiled and die as a beggar, you learned to make do. He needed a way to either uncover the mastermind behind his family's downfall or frame someone else. The problem, the crime he was supposed to commit, insulting the princess, wasn't just about slipping poison into her drink. Ordinary poison wouldn't work anyway. The third princess was a magical genius who could probably sniff out toxins with a single breath. No, Moon needed something special, Unfortunately, his memories of this mansion contained exactly 0 references to hidden stockpiles of rare poisons. That meant finding another source, preferably one that didn't involve him getting shanked in a back alley. He recalled a place from the novel, a hub of criminals and cutthroats who dealt in the kind of merchandise he was looking for. The problem? It wasn't exactly within walking distance, and sneaking out before a grand ceremony was just asking for trouble. As he stewed over his predicament, a sudden clatter snapped him out of his thoughts. A servant girl carrying a tea tray had tripped, sending the fine porcelain shattering across the floor. She winced, rubbing her ankle, and let out a miserable whimper about the wasted tea. Moon, still half distracted, mumbled, "Ah, my bad. I wasn't paying attention." The reaction was unexpected. The maid stiffened as if he'd just declared he was about to personally toss her out a window. My lord," she stammered, visibly pale despite the feverish flush on her face. "Please, I'll clean it up right away. I beg you, don't punish me. Don't have me dismissed. I'll do better, I swear." Moon blinked. "Wait, what?" She looked one stumble away from prostrating herself, which really hammered in just how awful his predecessor must have been. Had he truly been so terrifying that a single spilled cup of tea was a life-or-death scenario? Rubbing his temples, he sighed, "Relax. I'm not going to punish you." The girl hesitated. "You're not?" "No. And why are you even working? You look like you're about to drop dead." The maid, Noel, she introduced herself, looked taken aback by his concern, as if the concept of basic human decency was foreign to her. She tried to brush it off, explaining that there weren't enough workers due to preparations for the banquet. "That's a dumb excuse," Moon said flatly. "Sick people shouldn't work. Just hire more servants." A silence followed, so thick you could have cut it with a dull butter knife. Another maid, Anne, exchanged glances with Noel before hesitantly replying, But, my lord, you said we shouldn't bring in outsiders. You called them filthy." Moon fought the urge to groan. God, his past self was the worst. "Well, congratulations, I changed my mind. Follow my orders and get more people." Anne, ever the composed one, nodded, but Moon caught the way she eyed him as if she were preparing for some impending disaster. He could already tell she was going to keep a close watch on him now. Whatever. He had more important things to do, like find the one thing that could let him weasel out of his fate. A VIP pass to the black market. His past self, despite being utterly useless, had at least acquired one redeeming item. After ransacking his chest, he found it. The sleek black card practically oozed illegal activity. Was the original me a complete scumbag? He mused aloud, twirling it between his fingers. The answer was almost certainly yes. With his golden ticket in hand, he made his way to the Chesford trading house under the guise of buying jewelry for his parents. Then, slipping away unnoticed, he ventured toward the infamous city of Belrand. Finding the entrance to the black market was easy enough. It was the stinking, rat-infested sewer outside the capital. Lovely. Lighting a torch, he pressed forward until he reached a massive iron door guarded by a brute of a man. The guard's gaze was as warm as a slab of cold meat. "Who goes there?" "Sewer rat," Moon deadpanned. The man snorted. "Purpose." "Looking for carrion." That seemed to be the magic word. The guard grunted, stepping aside to let him through the towering doors. Inside, the underground black market stretched out before him, a chaotic sprawl of illicit goods and shady merchants selling everything from magical creatures to human lives. He ignored the slave traders and other disturbing sights, making a beeline for the potion vendors. A masked saleswoman greeted him with an unsettling level of enthusiasm. "Welcome, dear customer. First of the day, how delightful. What can I do for you?" "I need a special potion," he said, lowering his voice. Colorless, odorless, strong enough to knock out a mage for a few hours. She let out a knowing chuckle. Ah, a thrill seeker, are we? Many noblemen come here looking for entertainment. If you're interested, I can also connect you with a reliable slaver. Moon's stomach churned. Yeah, I'll pass. He turned to leave, but the moment his back was turned, her cheerful tone dropped into something far more sinister. You're lucky, she murmured, her voice now as smooth as poison. I just so happen to have exactly what you're looking for. Moon immediately notices something off about the merchant. She is completely hidden under a cloak, her voice altered by magic, and even her body is disguised. It's almost as if someone took paranoia and wrapped it up in a neat, shady little package. However, as she moves, bends, and gestures, it becomes apparent, despite all her efforts, she's definitely a woman. Interesting. A mysterious merchant hiding her identity in a place like this? That could only mean she had something to lose. And people with something to lose were people worth knowing. A plan begins to take root in Moon's mind. If he can establish a good relationship with her, she might prove useful after his inevitable exile. Because let's be honest, at this rate, he's about as doomed as a candle in a hurricane. Wait a moment, the merchant says as she rummages through her supplies. Moon isn't in any hurry. The important thing is getting what he came for. But before she can return, another figure appears, a hooded individual draped in black, radiating an aura of I definitely don't pay my taxes. The merchant greets the new arrival, and without wasting a second, the newcomer states their request. I need a powerful drug that leaves no magical traces. Moon's ears perk up. Oh, how delightfully suspicious. The merchant, momentarily surprised, quickly regains her composure. That's a rare request, she says, already sifting through her wares. Moon sizes up the new customer. Judging by the figure and subtle scent, a strange mix of lavender and steel, this person is also a woman. Judging by her confidence, she likely has access to these substances already, but wants something extra potent. The merchant finally presents a vial to Moon. It's aggressively bright, like if highlighters were weapons bright. He raises an eyebrow. This is undetectable. The merchant waves a hand dismissively. In red wine, absolutely. Besides, this thing is so strong, a single drop could knock out an elephant for hours. Moon blinks. He appreciates overkill as much as the next guy, but an elephant? The merchant, as if reading his thoughts, shrugs. Power comes at a price. Yeah, usually that price is don't be dumb enough to test it on yourself. Speaking of price, the potion costs 130,000. Moon is about to mentally curse his lack of funds when the hooded woman makes her move. I'll pay with information. The merchant, intrigued, leans forward. And how valuable is this information? More valuable than gold. Moon watches as the two strike a deal, the merchant studying the contents of the note skeptically at first, but after a moment she grins. Whatever she just learned was worth far more than any bag of coins. The hooded woman, satisfied, takes her potion and disappears into the shadows like a well-rehearsed cliché. Moon, not one to miss an opportunity, flashes his own VIP pass at the merchant. Her interest piques, and unexpectedly, she tosses him a small extra vial. What's this? He asks suspiciously. She smiles. A little enhancement. Makes the red potion even stronger. Fantastic. Now it'll take down 2 elephants. He thanks her and then, ever the opportunist, tries to fish for information about the hooded woman. The merchant smirks and makes a counter-offer. You can buy her from me. 90,000. Moon narrows his eyes. You just made that number up. She grins wider. Fine. 900,000. Oh, I'm leaving. As he steps out, he can practically hear the merchant laughing behind him. It's the kind of laugh that says, I just made a profit, and you'll never know how much. Outside, Moon processes everything that just happened. The black market is a cesspool of opportunists, and he's going to need someone a little more reliable in his corner if he wants to play this game right. Meanwhile, the merchant remains in her shop, chuckling to herself. She hadn't expected today to be interesting, but things were about to get very fun indeed. After all, the third princess herself would be at the banquet, new servants were being hired for the mansion, and an aristocrat was snooping around for undetectable drugs. The second prince, who despises his talented sister, might find this information worth buying, and the duke, who's had a falling out with the Campbell family, might also be willing to pay for it. Why pick sides when you can sell to both? A wicked smile crosses her face. She's about to kill two birds with one stone, and make a fortune doing it. The grand halls of Campbell Palace shimmered with opulence, chandeliers casting a golden glow over noble guests who had nothing better to do than sip expensive wine and judge each other in whispers. The event was as suffocatingly sophisticated as one would expect. Silk dresses, polished shoes, and enough forced smiles to make even the paintings on the walls cringe. Moon, standing at the center of it all, was playing the role of a charming young noble, a drastic departure from his predecessor's usual villainous persona. He had barely adjusted to his surroundings when a marquis approached, dragging his daughter along like an unwilling sacrifice. "This is my daughter, Lady Evelyn," the Marquis announced with the enthusiasm of a man delivering bad news. The girl, however, seemed to have a different idea about socializing. The moment her eyes met Moon's, her face turned the shade of an overripe tomato. Beads of nervous sweat formed on her forehead as her hands fidgeted with her dress. I, she stammered, her voice cracking like cheap porcelain. Moon raised an eyebrow, waiting for the usual pleasure to meet you, or even a half-hearted curtsy. Instead, the girl's pupils darted around in search of an escape route. My mother is calling me," she squeaked before spinning around and bolting out of the hall with the urgency of someone fleeing a burning building. A brief silence followed. The Marquis coughed awkwardly into his hand. "I apologize for my daughter's behavior. She's rather shy," he explained, though it was painfully obvious to everyone that shy wasn't quite the right word. Moon, keeping his expression perfectly composed, smiled diplomatically. "Not at all, my lord. I understand completely." Internally, though, he was struggling not to laugh. Ah, yes. The original Moon Campbell, so insufferable that young noble ladies would rather fake parental summons than spend a minute in his presence. If there were a competition for most avoided aristocrat, he would have won by unanimous decision. His amusement was short-lived as he caught the suspicious glances of the other guests. It wasn't just Lady Evelyn. Many in the crowd were looking at him with that same wary, distrustful gaze, as if waiting for him to do something obnoxiously villainous. He supposed he couldn't blame them. The original Moon had apparently set the bar so low that just standing still and smiling was already an improvement. At that moment, his father, Duke Long Campbell, approached with a rare nod of approval. "You're doing well, son." Moon blinked. "I am." The Duke nodded, clearly pleased. "Tonight is your night. You must prove yourself as a true Campbell. Show them your worth." Moon held back a sarcastic remark about how his mere presence was apparently already a miracle, and instead nodded respectfully. "I'll do my best, father." Before anything else could be said, the sound of a staff hitting the marble floor echoed through the hall. A hush fell over the crowd as an announcer's voice rang out, announcing the arrival of Her Imperial Highness, 3rd Princess Celia Leopold. The air itself seemed to freeze as she entered. Celia was the very image of elegance, her steps measured, her posture flawless. Blessed by the goddess of ice and snow, she carried herself with an aura of untouchable beauty, the kind that left commoners awestruck and nobles wary. Her silver-blue dress shimmered under the chandelier's light, perfectly complementing her cold, piercing gaze that scanned the room as though evaluating which of the attendees was worth acknowledging. As the last of the esteemed guests trickled in, Moon's father placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a rare smile gracing his usually stern face. "I'm going to receive the other dukes. I leave it to you. Remember, do not neglect Her Royal Highness the Princess." "Ah, yes, the ever-so-gentle reminder to not be a walking disaster. Truly touching." Moon responded with practiced confidence, placing one hand over his chest in a show of aristocratic discipline. She gracefully made her way towards him, each step measured and poised, like she was floating rather than walking. "Long time no see, young Master Moon," she greeted, her tone formal but distant. Moon, ever the charmer, or at least trying to be one today, put on his most diplomatic smile. "Long time no see, Princess Celia. You are extraordinarily beautiful today." Her response was as cold as a midwinter blizzard. "Is that so? Thank you for your compliment, but it's rare to hear such words from young Master Moon." Celia then lifted the hem of her skirt ever so slightly, bowed with flawless grace, and radiated pure, noble elegance. It was the kind of practiced perfection that made people feel like peasants just by existing near her. Moon, keeping up the charade, returned the bow with equal politeness, placing a hand on his chest. "Aha, Your Highness, what you're saying makes me seem like the kind of rude person who can't even control his mouth. Don't you think that's a bit unfair?" The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Celia's piercing gaze met his, and for the first time that evening, Moon felt genuine discomfort. Her voice dipped lower, colder. "Oh, so that's how it is. This wasn't just small talk. This was an interrogation in disguise." For a brief moment, Moon's brain short-circuited. If he didn't tread carefully, he was about to be verbally executed in front of high society. He quickly pivoted. "Ha ha ha ha, Your Highness must be tired after traveling from the royal city. Why don't you rest for a bit? The banquet won't officially start until later." A pause. Then Celia, without another word, turned on her heel and walked towards the rest area. "Well, that would be appreciated." As soon as she was out of sight, Moon let out a quiet exhale, rubbing the back of his head. "She's finally gone. Beautiful, truly beautiful, but also terrifying. Really terrifying. No wonder she's the novel's first female lead. Her aura alone is enough to crush a man's soul." Meanwhile, Celia was receiving the usual greetings from nobles as she moved through the hall, gracefully lifting the hem of her dress in return. But her mind was elsewhere. "He seems different today." She stole a glance back at Moon, still standing among the guests, his usual arrogance replaced with something eerily close to politeness. Has he actually changed? Before she could dwell on it further, the murmur of the crowd shifted. A slight commotion rippled through the room, low whispers carrying through the hall. Moon, sensing the shift in atmosphere, subtly tuned in. Nobles were always whispering behind one another's backs, but this had a different energy to it. "I can't believe that illegitimate daughter is here. Is she the one who dueled with her betrothed recently? I heard Duke Bugar just named her his heir, her. Unbelievable. Not only is she an illegitimate child, but a woman. How did she qualify to inherit the earldom?" Moon's eyes flickered toward the entrance. Sure enough, the person they were gossiping about had arrived. Two girls stepped inside, walking side by side, one tall, one short. Nobles on either side of the door cast them thinly veiled glares, their whispers only barely hidden behind wine glasses and decorative fans. Moon had expected this night to be exhausting, but now it was starting to look like an actual battlefield. As he stood among the nobles, his gaze locked onto two figures walking in from the entrance. Two people he knew all too well. and by knew he meant feared and respected in equal measure. The tall girl on the left, the one exuding an aura so overwhelming it could crush lesser men's egos on sight. The undisputed, battle-hardened, and absolutely terrifying true protagonist of this world, Ariel Bugert. And next to her, clinging onto her sleeve like a frightened rabbit, was none other than the Holy Maiden, Lee Angel. They weren't dressed in formal attire, no dazzling gowns, no layers of expensive jewelry, and yet they stood out more than anyone else in the room, mostly because Ariel carried herself with the attitude of someone who would sooner flip the entire banquet table than bow to aristocratic nonsense. Meanwhile, Lee looked like she wanted to evaporate into thin air, gripping Ariel's sleeve like a lifeline. Ariel didn't seem to care about the judgmental stares or whispered insults from the noble crowd. Instead, she crossed her arms, her cold expression unwavering, and walked forward like she owned the place. Then she casually raised a hand in greeting. "Hey, young Master Moon, we meet again. How have you been lately?" Moon, caught slightly off guard, was about to respond, maybe even pull off a passable, polite greeting, when disaster struck. An obese nobleman wearing glasses suddenly burst forward, practically foaming at the mouth. His stubby finger jabbed in Ariel's direction as he bellowed in outrage, "You lowly illegitimate daughter! How dare you speak to our young Master Moon like that?" Moon's soul briefly left his body. Oh no. No. This was exactly the kind of thing that got people killed. Without thinking, his instincts kicked in, and he lunged forward, slapping a hand over the nobleman's mouth before he could dig an even deeper grave. "Shut up," Moon hissed through gritted teeth. The nobleman flailed his arms wildly in surprise, muffled protests escaping beneath Moon's palm. Moon held on for dear life, looking every bit like a man trying to stop an active bomb from detonating in his hands. Ariel, watching this mess unfold, raised an eyebrow. Her usual cold exterior cracked for a second, as if she wasn't sure whether to be amused or annoyed. Moon forced a stiff smile as he awkwardly restrained the nobleman. "I've been doing well lately, Miss Ariel Bugard. Thank you for your concern." Ariel blinked at him. The Moon Campbell she knew, the insufferable, sneering, pompous noble brat. He had just politely responded to her. By her full name, no less. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She lowered her head slightly, covering her mouth with her hand as she pondered. What is happening here? Has he come to his senses? Or is this some elaborate scheme? His tiny peanut-sized brain is suddenly functioning. Meanwhile, Lee, standing awkwardly by Ariel's side, was still confused by the chaotic scene unfolding before her. Moon suddenly turned to her with a warm smile. "Miss Lee Angel," he said gently, offering his hand, "it is a pleasure to meet you." Lee's eyes widened like a startled deer. "Ah, young Master Moon actually knows my name," she blurted out in shock. Moon, playing the role of the polite gentleman to perfection, slightly bent forward, his outstretched hand, waiting for her to shake. "Of course. How could I not know the name of such an important guest tonight?" Before Lee could even think about taking his hand, it was slapped away, hard. Moon recoiled slightly, blinking in confusion. Ariel stood between them now, her gaze sharp and unreadable. Her expression had shifted from mildly suspicious to fully hostile. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked coldly. Moon stared at her, utterly baffled. "Offering a handshake?" Ariel clearly wasn't buying it. From her perspective, Moon suddenly being polite was far more suspicious than any insult he could have thrown at her. Ariel stepped closer. Too close. Her entire presence was practically suffocating as she leaned in, pressing against his chest in a way that would have been exciting if not for the pure rage radiating off of her. Moon instinctively leaned back, nervous sweat forming at his brow. Miss Ariel. She didn't let him finish. Her voice was low, sharp, and filled with venom. Moon Campbell, listen carefully. Moon gulped. I only came here out of respect for your father. I don't know what game you're playing, but let me make one thing clear. She jabbed a finger hard against his shoulder, eyes narrowing. If you try anything against Lee, I will personally make sure you regret it. Without waiting for a response, Ariel spun around and marched toward the hall's interior. Lee, let's go, she ordered without looking back. Lee hesitated, glancing back at Moon with uncertain eyes before hurrying after Ariel. And just like that, they were gone. Moon stood frozen in place, processing what just happened. Moon ran his hands up and down his chest, desperately trying to massage away the sheer terror Ariel had just implanted into his soul. He exhaled sharply, closed his eyes, and let out an awkward smile. So the original Moon Campbell really did have a horrible past with her. What a delightful inheritance. Shaking his head, he turned on his heel and made his way toward the second floor. He had a coming-of-age speech to give, after all. A bright future awaited him. Well, assuming he survived tonight. Looking straight ahead, he plastered on a carefree smile. No need to dwell on it. After tonight, our fates will go their separate ways. Two parallel lines never meant to intersect again. You will be your world's great savior, and I will be a diligent corporate slave living in the shadow of my noble family's expectations. A beautiful future for both of us, Miss Girl Overlord. In no time, the coming-of-age ceremony commenced. Moon stood on the observation deck of the second floor, his parents beaming proudly behind him, basking in the glow of their well-bred son. Below, nobles gathered like a sea of judgmental, expensive perfume-wearing sharks. Taking a deep breath, he bowed to the crowd. The room fell silent. Then, with the most dignified expression he could muster, he began, So, under the guidance of my dear parents. His voice rang through the hall, carrying the weight of an 18-year-old nobleman forced into adulthood way too soon. His chest puffed out, his gaze steady, like he wasn't mentally screaming inside. Each time he paused for breath, his parents smiled wider, as if they'd won some kind of Best Parenting award. When he finally uttered the grand closing line, I, Moon Campbell, have completed my coming-of-age speech at the age of 18, witnessed by all the nobles of the Empire. From today onward, I can officially be considered the heir of the Campbell family. His parents clapped proudly. The nobles naturally followed suit, their polite applause echoing through the hall. Moon stood there smiling like a perfect little heir should, but inwardly he knew. Well, that's a lie. Sure, he said the lines from the novel. Sure, he played his part, but after tonight, the story would shift. The so-called heir title might as well be a limited-time promotion. Still, the speech ended with enthusiastic applause, and Moon, finally, was allowed to loosen his tie and exhale. Finally, it's over, he muttered under his breath. And with that, the ballroom officially came alive. The nobles paired off with their dance partners, twirling across the hall like well-dressed marionettes. Laughter and polite conversations filled the air as Moon stood to the side, contemplating his next move. Time for the main task. His gaze swept across the ballroom, searching. Celia, where was she? His eyes landed near the grand French windows, and there she was. Princess Celia, untouched by the festive atmosphere, stood alone, holding a glass of red wine. The golden light from the chandeliers softened against her profile as she silently admired the night view outside. Moon sighed. Great. I abandoned the noble Royal Highness Princess to fend for herself. Truly, I am a flawless host. He walked up to her, bowing slightly. "I seem to have made a grave mistake," he said with an air of exaggerated regret. "Leaving the esteemed princess alone? How terribly disrespectful of me." Celia turned to face him, one eyebrow arched. "Moon Campbell." He elegantly extended his hand, the picture of noble charm. His other hand rested behind his back as he gave a slight bow. "I wonder," he mused, tilting his head slightly, "if I might be fortunate enough to have this dance with you." Celia blinked, caught off guard. "You're inviting me?" Moon's smile was warm, dangerously so. "Of course, my beautiful highness." She hesitated, lips parting as if to protest, but after a moment she let out a small sigh. Shutting her eyes briefly, she reached forward, placing her delicate hand into his. "Well," she murmured, "it is your coming-of-age ceremony. I suppose I have no reason to refuse." Moon's smile widened slightly. "Thank you, Your Highness." The dance floor had become the center of attention, and the nobles, ever the professional gossip-mongers, were practically drooling at the spectacle before them. They whispered to one another in hushed yet not so hushed tones, their curiosity piqued. "Is that Princess Celia dancing? And with Moon Campbell, of all people? I thought she hated him. What in the aristocratic hell is happening?" Meanwhile, Lee, standing among the crowd, tugged urgently at Ariel's sleeve. "Ariel, look!" Ariel, who had been in the middle of stuffing a particularly delicious piece of cake into her mouth, barely looked up. "Huh? What's wrong?" she mumbled, crumbs falling onto her dress. Lee gestured toward the dance floor with wide eyes. There, under the golden glow of the chandeliers, Moon and Celia glided effortlessly across the floor, hands intertwined as they moved through an elegant sequence of steps. Celia followed his lead gracefully, tilting her head up most slightly to meet his gaze. "Your dance steps are good," she murmured. Moon flashed his signature polite smile. "Thank you for your praise, Your Highness, but I assure you this is just beginner's level." As they danced, Celia studied his face carefully. Tonight's conversations had confirmed something she had been suspecting for a while. "You have indeed changed a bit, Moon Campbell." Moon raised an eyebrow. "Oh boy, here we go." "In what way?" he asked, feigning innocent curiosity. "Am I not behaving like a nobleman?" Celia's expression remained unreadable. "No, it's the way you invite people." Moon blinked, confused. "The way I invite people?" Celia's lips curved into something that almost resembled a smirk. "I recall the last time you invited the daughter of a viscount to the Academy Ball. Your exact words were..." She suddenly deepened her voice, perfectly mimicking his old pompous tone. "Woman, rejoice and cheer. I have mercifully rewarded you with a dance with me." Moon physically recoiled. His soul left his body. His entire bloodline probably cringed from beyond the grave. He turned his head slightly, avoiding eye contact. "Ah, well, you see, Celia's smirk disappeared, her tone turning cold again. "How was that? Did I imitate it well?" Moon forced a smile, the very picture of "please, stop talking." "It was my mistake, Your Highness. Can we pretend that never happened?" Unfortunately for him, Celia had a long memory and a very sharp tongue. Before she could continue her verbal execution, the orchestra transitioned smoothly into the next part of the song, prompting the dancers to shift positions. Celia leaned slightly into him, and Moon, ever the gentleman, held her hand just a little tighter to guide her into the new movements. Then he lowered his head and whispered in her ear, "After this dance, may I invite Your Highness to my room?" Celia instantly stiffened. Her expression darkened, and she prepared to reject him on the spot. "Moon Campbell," she said icily, "although you and I are engaged, we—" Moon, sensing the impending royal smackdown, quickly cut in. "I understand, Your Highness. I have no intention of overstepping any boundaries." He paused for dramatic effect, then added smoothly, "What I want to discuss with your highness in detail is about the engagement." Celia blinked, caught off guard. Her icy exterior wavered for a brief moment before she raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh, the band's melody shifted seamlessly into its next movement, prompting the nobles to adjust their steps in perfect synchronization. Among them, at the center of it all, Moon and Silesia continued their dance. Hands clasped, eyes meeting in a fleeting moment of understanding beneath the weight of their shared burdens. As they moved with the rhythm, Moon leaned in, his voice a quiet murmur meant only for Silesia's ears. "Do you need to have a private discussion with me about our engagement?" The words came smoothly, calculated, just as he had rehearsed in his mind. His hand pressed gently against hers as he guided her through the next set of movements. He knew Silesia would be skeptical, so he painted his deception carefully, laying out the undeniable truths of their situation. "I know your highness doesn't like me," he admitted with a soft, knowing smile. "And our relationship, it's nothing more than a political arrangement, something His Majesty orchestrated to maintain ties with my father." Silesia's gaze flickered, but she said nothing. Encouraged by the lack of immediate rejection, Moon pressed on. "This engagement, it's a symbol, a tool to maintain balance. If you were to openly propose its cancellation, it would cast doubt on the royal family's credibility and strain the relationship between you and His Majesty. Am I wrong?" For the first time that evening, Silesia's expression shifted, her lips parting slightly before she gave a small nod of agreement. Moon allowed himself a quiet exhale. He was leading her exactly where he needed her to go. Lowering his voice even more, he whispered near her ear, "So, at least when it comes to ending this engagement, we share the same goal. If we work together, perhaps we can find a way to part without scandal, without disgrace. Wouldn't that be preferable, Your Highness?" Silesia's eyes widened slightly, just for a moment. Then closing them, she let out a slow breath, as if weighing the weight of his words against her own unspoken thoughts. Finally, she answered, her voice steady but low. "I understand. This can only be discussed privately between you and me." Moon concealed his satisfaction with a simple, courteous smile, but inside, triumph stirred. She believed him. She took the bait. "Sorry, Your Highness, but for the sake of my survival, I have no choice." Just as he relished his small victory, Silesia's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. "Where is your room?" Moon froze. His mind stumbled over itself, struggling to process her sudden question. Room? His room? Now? Before he could muster a response, Silesia had already made her decision. Without hesitation, she took his arm and began leading him out of the ballroom, her grip firm and unwavering. "Wait, Your Highness." Moon barely managed to keep up as Silesia strode forward with purpose, paying no attention to the curious glances thrown their way. Around them, whispers began to ripple through the noble crowd. A handful of guests followed their movement with raised eyebrows, their murmurs lost beneath the sound of the waltz. The heir to the Campbell family, leaving his own coming-of-age ball in the company of the Lionheart King's daughter? Alone? At the far end of the hall, where the golden light of the chandeliers faded into shadows, two figures watched in silence. One of the maids, a short-haired woman with keen, observant eyes, lowered her broom, narrowing her gaze at the sight of Moon being dragged away. "She's leaving with that idiot young master," she muttered. Beside her, a long-haired maid stole a glance before nodding. Neither of them spoke further, but the air between them was thick with understanding. Whatever Silesia and Moon were up to, it was something that needed to be dealt with. The short-haired maid exhaled, rolling up her sleeves. "Keep watch. I'll handle it." The long-haired maid barely spared her a glance. "Be quick. This is the Lionheart King's territory." With that, the two maids silently melted into the crowd. Meanwhile, Moon barely had time to register his surroundings before they arrived at his chambers. To steady himself, he reached for a bottle of red wine from a nearby shelf, along with 2 glasses. If nothing else, formality was key. "Would you like a drink, Your Highness?" he asked, carefully masking his nervousness. But Chalasia's response was immediate, sharp. "Sorry, I don't drink." Moon nearly fumbled the bottle. "Ah, it's just red wine," he tried again, forcing an easy smile. "A little won't hurt." Red wine is also not allowed. Moon watched as Chalasia closed her eyes briefly, then tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with practiced elegance. "My constitution cannot tolerate alcohol," she said simply. Moon's fingers tightened around the bottle. "What?" His face remained neutral, but inside alarm bells were ringing. "She doesn't drink?" His eyes flickered toward the wine, then to the cabinet where, just minutes ago, he had hidden the real tool of his plan. A small vial filled with a vivid red liquid. The potion he was supposed to slip into her glass, the one that would ensure her temporary unconsciousness. But now he was stuck. The novel never mentioned exactly how Silesia lost consciousness that night. He had assumed it was through the wine, but if she didn't drink, then... Moon's pulse quickened. "This isn't good." Moon's smile was tight, forced as he turned to Calicia, trying to keep his voice as natural as possible. "If Your Highness doesn't drink wine, what would you like to drink instead?" Silesia's expression remained neutral as she pondered the question for a brief moment. "Coffee. Only black tea before..." Before she could even finish her sentence, Moon cut in, blurting out another drink name, one that was still red. Silesia's brows furrowed slightly, an almost imperceptible flicker of confusion crossing her face. Moon quickly composed himself, stepping toward her with practiced grace. Placing one hand over his chest, he bowed slightly, adopting an apologetic posture. "Due to some unforeseen circumstances, no other beverages are available tonight except for red wine and black tea," he said smoothly. His voice was calm, carefully measured, but inside his heart pounded. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, sharp and assessing. Even though his words had come out flawlessly, he couldn't shake the fear that she might notice something was off. Calasia rested her chin on her hand, her head tilting slightly in thought. "Only black tea." A short pause, then she nodded, seemingly unconcerned. "Then I'll have that." Moon barely managed to suppress the relieved sigh threatening to escape him. Instead, he let his face light up with a polite enthusiasm, his voice carrying just the right amount of joy. "Okay, I'll go get it now." Silesia's eyes were on his back. She watched him move with quiet scrutiny, her face unreadable. He was acting far too excited over something as simple as brewing tea. Is making tea really such a joyful thing for this guy? She wondered silently. Moon, oblivious to her inner thoughts, worked swiftly, pouring the freshly brewed black tea into 2 porcelain teacups. He set them down on the counter, his back still turned to Silesia. Now came the crucial moment. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then, with meticulous care, he popped open the lid and tilted the bottle over one of the teacups. A single drop of the shimmering red liquid slipped into the dark tea, dissolving instantly. Moon's lips pressed together in a thin line before he tilted the bottle further, letting a few more drops mix into the tea. He had no idea exactly how potent this stuff was, but it was better to be safe than sorry. Then he shifted his attention to the second vial, the white potion. His grip tightened around it, his expression darkening slightly. "I have no idea what this one does." A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Before he could contemplate further, Silesia's voice suddenly rang out from behind the wall. "Is the tea ready?" Moon flinched, His fingers jerked, and before he could stop himself, the white potion's cap popped off. His heart nearly stopped. "Ah!" The small, startled sound escaped him before he could swallow it down. Panicked, he spun around, shoving both bottles behind his back, his palms clenching around the glass vials as if his life depended on it. Silesia's piercing gaze met his. She was standing there, expression unreadable, her presence exuding an eerie calm. Moon's mind screamed at him to stay composed. With an awkward smile stretched across his face, he let out a nervous chuckle. Almost done, Your Highness." Silesia didn't say anything. She simply stared. Then, without a word, Silesia nodded. She turned away, making her way back to the sofa, her elegant steps light against the floor. Moon remained frozen for a moment, watching her retreat. She hadn't noticed. A wave of cold relief washed over him, but it did nothing to calm his nerves. His palms were damp with sweat as he turned back toward the counter. Moon closed his eyes, his breath shaky as he wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. A shiver ran down his spine. That was too close. If Silesia had seen what he was doing, if she had noticed anything amiss, his fate would have been sealed. His hands trembled slightly at the thought, but he had reacted quickly enough. But then, something caught his eye. His gaze dropped to the floor, his breath hitching. A dark stain gleamed faintly against the polished wood. Red. His pupils contracted, the exact same color as the potion. His expression frozen in disbelief. Did I spill it? Moon's entire body went rigid, his fingers twitching slightly before he reached out in despair toward the wasted potion on the floor. This was supposed to be my first bucket of gold. The plan had been perfect. Water it down, divide it into thousands of portions, sell it off as a sleeping aid. Easy money. Even if he had been exiled, even if his noble status had been stripped away, this would have been his lifeline. And now, all gone. He could almost see the phantom image of gold coins vanishing before his very eyes, fluttering away like delicate butterflies, forever out of reach. His soul ached. Just then, a voice shattered his trance. "Young Master Moon?" His body jolted upright, his breath catching. "Silesia." Her voice was smooth but carried a firm undertone of expectation. Moon snapped back to reality, shoving his grief aside as he scrambled to his feet. "Ah, yes, right away." As he approached, neither he nor Silesia noticed the shadowy figure standing just beyond the window. A silent observer, watching, and then vanishing into the darkness. Moon, unaware of the presence lurking outside, carefully presented Silesia with her cup. She reached for it, but as soon as her eyes settled on the tea, "Young Master Moon, your black tea." Moon stiffened. "So red, and it seems to glow." His breath stopped. She lifted the cup slightly, her sharp gaze analyzing the liquid with careful precision. The deep red hue was unnatural, too vivid, too intense, and floating within the tea were glimmering specks like scattered stardust suspended in liquid. She had never seen tea like this before. Moon's stomach twisted into knots. Cold sweat gathered at his temples once again, his nerves screaming in alarm. He forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't panic now. His gaze flickered toward the ceiling, avoiding her sharp eyes as he scrambled for an explanation. This is a newly procured, highly precious tea from the Eastern Kingdom," he blurted out. "It's called Big Red Robe. Yes, that's the name. A perfect excuse. At least he hoped so." Her fingers traced the smooth porcelain of the cup as she glanced at him, her lips curving slightly. Is that so?" Then, her next words made his heart nearly stop. "Well then, young Master Moon, you should drink first." His throat went dry. He swallowed hard, forcing a shaky smile onto his lips. Would I be the kind of person to do such a thing? He asked, voice light but unsteady. Calacia, however, remained calm. She sighed softly and shook her head. Young Master Moon is too sensitive, she remarked, her tone even. As the host, you should drink first. That is basic etiquette. Moon's mind spun, but he knew he had no choice. Okay, he murmured, resigning himself. Since your highness doesn't believe me, then I... He lifted the cup, bringing it closer to his lips. Then... Wait a moment. He froze, his heart clenched. Slowly, he turned to look at her. Calacia's eyes flickered toward his cup. Her expression was thoughtful, her lips curving slightly. Then, to his absolute horror, she reached out and took his cup. Moon's breath caught in his throat, and then, for the first time that night, she smiled, a small, knowing smile. His heart stopped. How about we swap? Moon's lips parted slightly, his voice caught somewhere between a protest and sheer panic. His words wouldn't come out. Before he could react, before he could think, Calacia had already lifted the cup to her lips and took a sip, a small, delicate sip. The room fell into absolute silence. Moon watched in horror as she sat frozen, motionless. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. He reached out instinctively, his voice shaking. Your Highness? Moon watched as Calacia's expression shifted, her eyes turning hazy, her breath unsteady. A faint red flush crept across her face, and before she could say another word, her body wavered. The teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor as she collapsed onto the sofa, completely unconscious. For a moment, Moon froze. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Then, slowly, he exhaled. The potion worked, he murmured under his breath. He swallowed hard, scanning her still form. His plan had worked, perhaps a little too well. The potion had been advertised as strong, but seeing it take effect so quickly on someone as powerful as Calacia was almost terrifying. He rubbed the back of his neck, a cold sweat forming. All right, now what? The novel's plot flashed through his mind. If everything was going as written, the Overlord girl, the last person he wanted to deal with right now, was going to show up any minute. He had to set the stage perfectly. He reached forward, carefully adjusting the folds of Calacia's gown. Nothing inappropriate, just enough to create the illusion of disarray. To match the scene from the original story, his own appearance had to match as well. He ruffled his hair, loosened the stiff collar of his noble attire, and made sure he looked just the right amount of disheveled. Every little detail mattered. Glancing at the door, he took a deep breath. All set. Now, time to let the misunderstanding begin. Moon remained in the dimly lit room, sitting in tense anticipation. His fingers lightly tapped the wooden table as he stared at the door, waiting for Ariel to burst in, just as she did in the original novel, to rescue the princess and end this ordeal. But time passed. Too much time. Moon furrowed his brows, flipping open his silver pocket watch. What's going on? He murmured, his grip tightening around the watch. By now, Ariel was supposed to charge in, sword drawn, to expose him and bring this whole act to its dramatic climax. Half an hour had already slipped by. His stomach twisted uneasily. This isn't right. Moon ran through the events in his head, searching for a reason behind the delay. He shut his eyes, carefully retracing the original plot, mentally pulling apart each thread of the story. And then, his breath hitched. The maid. Noel. A fragmented memory surfaced. In the novel, a blonde maid had accidentally spilled tea on Ariel's dress, forcing her to leave for the bathroom, where she stumbled upon Moon's scheme. But yesterday, Moon had dismissed all the sick maids, including Noel. A cold realization washed over him. I changed the plot. His eyes darted towards Silesia, still lying unconscious on the sofa. The faint glow of the room's lanterns flickered across her face, highlighting the unnatural flush in her cheeks, the uneasy furrow of her brows. His hands curled into fists. If the story had already deviated, what would happen next? Calm down, there has to be a way to fix this. But before he could think any further, something changed. The air in the room, it was different. A creeping chill slithered through the space, wrapping around him like an unseen force. It was subtle at first, a delicate frost brushing against the wooden floor, the faintest shimmer of ice dusting over the table. Then the temperature dropped. Moon's breath became visible in the air. He turned his head slightly, his senses tingling. Before he could finish his thought, a pair of hands stretched toward him. His eyes widened. A crackling force erupted behind him, sending a shockwave of glacial energy surging through the room. A blast of blue magic tore through the furniture, shattering chairs, splintering wood, and coating every surface in ice. The once warm room transformed into an icy abyss, frozen over in an instant. Moon barely had time to react before something crashed into him. Silesia. She had awoken, her body still feverish from the potion, pressed against him as she instinctively unleashed another pulse of chilling energy. A mist of frost swirled around them, biting into his skin, stealing the warmth from the air. Moon's mind screamed in alarm. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as his mind raced. Did she realize it? Did she know something had been added to her drink? Was she upset? Was this some kind of punishment? No. Your Highness, please, listen to me. I can explain. His voice was hurried, desperate. It's not what you think. You drank the... But before he could finish, Calatia suddenly murmured, her voice a soft whisper carried by the cold air. It's so hot. Moon's chest tightened. His instincts screamed at him. This was not normal. His palms pressed against the frozen floor as he attempted to lift himself up. No, this isn't right. Your Highness, hold on. I'll go get a doctor right away. But just as he tried to stand, the ice around his wrists tightened. A sharp sting of cold spread up his arms, locking him in place. Moon's breath hitched. Silesia had restrained him. She moved closer, her movements slow, deliberate. Your body is so cool. It feels nice, she whispered. Moon's breath came faster. Your Highness, wake up! This isn't like you, his voice wavered. Ariel, someone! But before he could call for help, Silesia leaned closer and, in a fleeting moment, pressed a soft kiss against his lips. Elsewhere in the Duke's mansion, the rhythmic sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the grand hallway. Ariel walked briskly, her handkerchief dabbing at her dress as she frowned. She sighed in frustration, muttering under her breath. My dear Lai, how could she be so clumsy? She had been looking for a bathroom to clean up when she suddenly stopped in her tracks. A strange feeling prickled at the edges of her senses. She lifted her head, scanning the corridor ahead. Empty. Her blue eyes narrowed. Who's there? She called out, her voice steady. For a moment, silence. Then the quiet creak of a door. A maid slowly emerged from one of the rooms, her posture graceful as she stepped into the light. Excuse me, miss. Ariel's gaze flickered over the woman. The maid closed her eyes, placed a hand over her chest, and bowed. I must kindly ask you not to proceed any further, she said, her voice gentle but firm. This area is restricted within the Duke's mansion. Please turn back. Ariel's brows furrowed. Restricted? She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. The Duke's estate was enormous, but as an esteemed guest, she had never been informed of any off-limits areas. What kind of restricted area is this? She questioned, her curiosity piqued. The maid, still wearing a calm, practiced smile, responded without hesitation. I'm afraid that information is confidential, miss. I am not authorized to explain. Ariel's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't like that answer. How secretive, she muttered under her breath. But before she could question the maid further, the woman's sharp eyes flickered downward, noticing the stains on Ariel's skirt. Without hesitation, she gracefully knelt, inspecting the damage. "Miss, it seems your dress is stained." Ariel sighed, glancing down at the mess once more. "Yeah, I was just looking for a bathroom to clean it." The maid's expression remained serene. "Allow me." Without waiting for a response, she raised her hands, a faint glow of emerald light gathering at her fingertips. A wave of soft, green, magical energy enveloped Ariel's dress. The stains lifted effortlessly, dissolving into the air as if they had never existed. Ariel blinked. She looked down, running her fingers over the now pristine fabric. "Wow," she murmured, impressed. She had seen many forms of magic before, but this was seamless, elegant. Her gaze flickered back to the maid, a glint of curiosity in her eyes. "Oh, as expected of the Campbell family," she mused. "Even the maids here can use magic?" The woman merely smiled. "I know only a little," she replied humbly, lowering her hands. "It's not worth mentioning." She blinked a few times, then looked up at Anne, who was calmly wiping her hands with a handkerchief. "It's already cleaned, miss." Then, as if remembering something, she added with a smile, "Also, let me remind you, in a little while the banquet will be serving a limited number of pachichi cakes. If you like them, please don't miss it." Ariel froze, her thoughts, worries, and mild suspicions all instantly erased. Did she hear that right? Pachichi cake? Her favorite dessert in the entire world. Her eyes lit up with childlike excitement, hands balling into small fists as a rush of energy coursed through her. "Oh no," she gasped, her face practically glowing with anticipation. "A limited number?" Her stomach practically growled in agreement. There was no way she could risk missing out. Without a second thought, she spun on her heel, already preparing to dash back to the banquet hall. As she turned slightly, she waved back at Anne with a bright smile. "Thank you for your help, Miss Maid, but I have something important to do now. I have to go grab that cake." Anne gave a gentle wave in return, her lips curling into a small smile. "You're welcome. Take care." She watched as Ariel's figure disappeared down the corridor, the young noble practically flying toward her goal. Once Ariel was gone, Anne slowly lowered her hand. Her warm expression faded like a candle being snuffed out. The pleasant, polite smile was gone, replaced by a cool, unreadable gaze. She turned, her eyes shifting toward a certain part of the hallway, towards something unseen, something secret. Ariel sprinted forward, her heart racing, not from fear, but from pure determination. She wasn't just running. She was on a mission. The pachichi cake was rare, a delicacy among the nobility, and knowing the crowd at this banquet, it would disappear in mere moments. She couldn't let that happen. Still, even in her excitement, her sharp mind replayed her interaction with Anne. That maid was a little strange. Ariel frowned slightly, whispering under her breath. She smelled like blood. It wasn't strong, nor was it overwhelming, but for someone with her heightened senses, it was unmistakable. A faint, lingering scent, something hidden beneath the surface. And then there was the other presence. Someone else had been there, watching. Ariel had sensed them, just out of sight, carefully concealed. But she wasn't interested in digging deeper. Whatever was going on in the Campbell household, it wasn't her problem. As for Princess Silesia, Ariel recalled seeing her leave the ballroom with Moon. She hesitated for a moment, but then shook her head. Silesia is a top-tier magic prodigy. There's no way she'd be in danger. If anything, Moon was the one who needed to be careful. With that thought pushed aside, Ariel focused on the most pressing matter: the cake. Her expression turned serious. She clenched her fists and increased her speed, eyes shining with determination. Nothing is more important than my pachichi cake. A woman with short, dark hair leaned against the cold wall, fingers curled around the hilt of a dagger. Her sharp eyes remained locked on the door, her posture coiled and ready. Every sound, every movement in the corridor outside was carefully tracked. At the first sign of an intruder, she would strike. The footsteps outside gradually faded. Only when silence returned did she exhale, her grip loosening slightly. "She's gone," she murmured, voice low and calculated. Across the room, a second figure, taller with long flowing hair, knelt on one knee, her fingers tracing intricate symbols onto the stone floor. A red glow flickered at her fingertips, the magic circle beneath her growing more elaborate with each passing second. The short-haired woman eyed her warily. "Was she one of your targets?" she asked. The long-haired woman didn't pause in her work. "No, she was originally the target of number 9. At that, the short-haired woman stiffened. Her fingers twitched against the handle of her dagger. "Number 9, she echoed, her voice carrying a hint of something unreadable. A memory surfaced, one she didn't particularly enjoy remembering. A mission. A failure. The long-haired woman continued, her voice even. That girl managed to surpass her opponent by 2 whole realms, but in the end she was still defeated. Silence stretched between them. The short-haired woman clicked her tongue, shaking off the thought. Her sharp eyes flickered toward the intricate magic array, her brows furrowing. "You're taking too long," she warned. The long-haired woman didn't stop drawing, though sweat beaded along her temple. "This isn't a simple task," she said calmly. "This spell was originally laid down by Lionheart King Ron Campbell. It covers the entire duchy. Quietly opening a gap without alerting him isn't easy." The short-haired woman exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening into a fist. "Well, we don't have much time," she muttered. "If Moon Campbell or Princess Silesia suddenly show up, our mission is as good as over." The long-haired woman knew she was right. She forced herself to work faster, her hands moving with precision despite her dwindling stamina. Sweat dripped onto the floor. The glow of the red magic intensified, and yet, despite the urgency, a small smirk tugged at the corners of her lips. "We have time," she murmured, "because just now, when I was scouting the outer walls," she recalled what she had seen. In that dimly lit room, Silesia, unconscious, lying atop Moon. Moon, pinned beneath her, unable to move, his face frozen in shock. "I don't think they'll be interrupting us anytime soon,"